Hi everyone, I'm Jane, and today we're going to talk about the different types of gel and paste mediums. There's so many different mediums out there, and I've had a lot of questions about when to use a certain one, what this gel does, what this paste does, and just some general confusion. So we're going to touch on 7 different mediums today, which will hopefully give you a little bit of insight into knowing what other gel and paste mediums do. Make sure you check out the video description below for a full list of all of the mediums that I'm covering in today's video. Now let's get started. So I have a variety of mediums here, and there's really hundreds and hundreds of different mediums. These are ones that I either use a lot or ones that you guys have asked me a lot about. But the basics that I'm going to be teaching you about these will help you with other mediums that you might come across. Let's start out figuring out how to know what the specific properties are of a medium. So let's start with this one. This is the Liquitex glass beads. No matter what brand it is, on the back of the jar, it should have the specifics. So on the back here, we have 4 little diagrams. The first one tells you whether or not the product is used in preparation, whether it's used in the painting process, or whether it's used in the finishing process. And all of these mediums here say that they're used in the painting process. However, most of them you can use in the preparation process. A lot of them you can use in place of gesso. This next diagram here says fluid or thick, and as you can see, the little indicator is closer to the thick side, meaning this is not a liquid medium, this is more of a gel. It's got a little bit more texture and body to it. This next slider says matte and gloss, and as you can see, the little indicator is on the gloss end, meaning this is a high shine product. It's not gonna be dull, which would be matte. This one says transparent and opaque, and as you can tell, the little indicator is closest to the transparent end, meaning that you'll be able to see through this product. So that's a good place to start. No matter what brand it is that you're using, look at the back and look for any indicators like this, and they may vary from product to product. They may not all be the same, but they'll give you a good idea of what the product will do and what it will look like when it's dry. The first set of mediums we're going to talk about are gels. And when you see the word gel, you know that it's not going to be absorbent. When you paint on top of it, the paint is going to sit on top of it. It will bind and adhere to it, but it's not going to absorb down into it like it would on cardboard or paper. It'll be more like painting on plastic. So when you see the word gel, you know it's probably going to be shiny unless it says matte, and it's not going to be absorbent. The first product we're going to talk about is gloss gel, and I've prepped a bunch of little canvas boards and written the name of the medium along this side here. And I painted it in blue so that as we go along, when we start mixing paint with the mediums, you can see whether or not they're transparent and how they might affect the color that you mix in it, but also what it might do if you layer it over top of another color. So the gloss gel, it's going to dry clear as long as you don't apply it too thickly. If you apply it quite thick, it may end up being just a little bit translucent once it's dry. As you can see, it's a little on the thicker side, but the consistency is very similar to heavy body paints. So see if I scoop a little out, it holds its form, it doesn't fall off the palette knife. Put some on a plate here and we'll start showing you. See how it's holding its shape really, really well. We've got a nice peak on there. Now when you mix it with paint, it's gonna do a few things. It's gonna extend the paint, meaning you can add a little bit of paint. It's gonna extend the volume of it without changing it. So if I add an equal part of paint to this, I'm gonna have essentially twice as much paint. It's not gonna thin the color down or change the color. It's also going to give it a consistency very similar to oil paint and make it quite bright. Now transparent colors are going to end up being a little more transparent with this one. So let's start with some yellow paint. I'm going to put out here about an equal amount of paint to how much medium I have. And then I'm going to mix them together. Now this is just the Liquitex Basics yellow paint, but as you can see, the color didn't change. And now I've got a consistency of paint very similar to heavy body paint. So let's apply it to our canvas and see what happens. So I'm just gonna pick up a big glob of it here. And on this side, I'll apply it. And you can spread it kind of like frosting, get it smooth. You can really get in there and get some texture and peaks. So we'll spread it kind of thin here at the bottom. And we'll get it nice and thick up here with some good texture. And see, that looks just like the yellow paint straight out of the tube, but now I have twice as much of it because the gel helped extend it. Now this gel, when it's wet, notice it's kind of got a white color to it, but as it dries, it will become transparent. And we know that yellow is quite transparent, so as this dries, we're gonna see more of that blue come up behind it. Now up here where it's quite thick, remember when I said that if you apply it heavier, it's gonna dry more translucent. So up here where it's quite heavy, we probably won't see quite as much of the blue. But if you notice those high peaks that we have right in here, that's gonna stay as it dries. Acrylic paint tends to be self-leveling, and if you take the basics paint anyway and try and get some good texture, as it dries it flattens out. But this isn't going to, it's gonna stay nice and high, just like that. Now let's take some of the gel by itself and apply it here so we can see the difference once it's dry. So just like with the yellow, I'm gonna make it kind of thin down here at the bottom. This does not dry quickly. This will take at least a full day to dry, and maybe a little bit more than that since I applied it so heavy at the top here. Now, as I mentioned in the video where we talked about gloss and matte mediums, you can use the gloss gel, kind of like you do with the gloss medium, to help get a little bit of glazing effect. The difference would be whether or not you want texture. So if you're just trying to glaze a flat surface, then you would want to use the glazing medium or gloss medium. But if you want more of an oil painting texture or a little more impasto that's transparent, then you would use the gloss gel. So we'll set this aside to dry and we'll come back to it later. The next one we're going to talk about is gloss heavy gel. So this is very similar to the gloss gel. The difference being the texture of this one is much, much firmer. And when you add this one to your paint, you can get a texture very, very similar to oil paint, much more so than the gloss gel itself. And it's also gonna extend the open time of the paint much more than any other medium. So if you mix this with your paints, you're really gonna be able to get an oil painting type experience. So we're gonna take some of this off of here, and it's a lot heavier. It's a very, very firm gel. So let's mix some yellow paint with it. And again, with this one, the heavier you apply it, the more translucent it's gonna be, meaning it won't be completely transparent. You'll get a little bit of an opacity to it. So I'm gonna mix an even amount of yellow paint in here. And again, this is just the Liquitex Basics yellow. And mix it in. So where the other medium, the other gel medium helps your paint have more of a texture similar to the Liquitex Heavy Body, this is gonna give you a texture much closer to oil paint. All right, let's spread this on here and see what happens. And again, I'm gonna do it thinner at the bottom here and heavier at the top. Now the amount of texture that we can get with this medium is gonna be much stronger than with the other one. You can get some serious peaks with this one. So this is great for palette knife work and all kinds of impasto that you might wanna do. I'm gonna get those nice shapes that you kind of squish in there. Get some good ridges from the palette knife. So there, if you can see that peak, see if we can get it up there just a little bit more. And again, it's not self-leveling like acrylic paint typically is, so as it dries, it's gonna hold that peak. So because this one increases the open time, if you're doing a lot of palette knife work where you need to do some blending as you go, this is gonna be the one that you probably want to use. and it's gonna take a lot longer to dry than the regular gloss gel that we already did. Let's add some all by itself over here on the side. And see, it's almost like carving into kind of warm butter or something. It's very, very thick. And look how high the texture is on that. And we'll set this one aside to dry as well. The next one we're going to talk about is matte gel. Now this is very similar to the gloss gel, but it has a matte finish, but it is a little bit thicker and it's not going to make your paint quite as transparent as the gloss gel, though it will increase the transparency a little bit. You'll get more of a translucent effect. And like the gloss gel, it's going to increase the volume of the paint. So if I add an equal amount of my yellow paint to that amount of medium, then it appears that I have twice as much paint and it's much firmer than the regular basics yellow would be, closer to the heavy body. Now when you're working with super transparent paints, this is probably a better choice than gloss gel if you don't want your paint to be quite so transparent, because it's not going to give it that glassy, clear effect. It'll be more matte and a little bit more opaque. But again, we'll get some good texture on there. And again, just like I mentioned in the video for the matte medium, you can use this similar to the liquid matte medium, but when you want more texture or you're trying to get an oil painting type look. So it's going to increase the open time of your paint, which helps with blending, and it gives you the texture. So see our little peaks right in here, and those will stay once it's dry. Let's add some by itself over here. And again, like we talked about in the fluid gloss and matte medium video, you don't have to decide which one of these products you want to use solely based on the gloss or matte finish, because you can varnish it using either gloss or matte and get the desired finishing effect that you want. They each do different things. The gloss finish and the matte finish are not the only difference in these mediums, which you'll see once they're all dry. All right, the next one we're going to talk about is modeling paste. Now this is where we start talking about the mediums that are more absorbent and opaque. When you see the word paste, you know that it's probably going to be absorbent and it's most likely going to be opaque. Now this jar is very heavy and it probably weighs as much as 2 jars of gel medium on its own. And the reason for that is because this is made with marble dust. So as you can see, it's very, very thick, very opaque, and just from opening it, I have some large peaks in here. So this is gonna dry very, very opaque. And it's also gonna have a texture very similar to stone, which once it's dry, you can actually sand it, drill it, you can carve it. This is pretty interesting stuff that you can do a lot of different things with that you can't do with some of the other mediums. If you wanna make it a little bit more of a flexible medium, maybe not quite so dense and hard, you can mix it with any of the gel mediums. So let's take a little bit of it out. And it's actually fairly smooth. It's very creamy. I'm gonna put some out right there. Now the thing with this one, since it's a white medium and it's gonna dry opaque and at this same color, when you add paint to it, it's not gonna look exactly like the paint that you add to it. It's gonna tint it just a little bit, make it just a little bit more pastel, which might not be so obvious when using yellow, but if you were to put black in it, you'd get more of a stony gray color here. So I'm gonna mix about half yellow. You can absolutely use this as a ground in place of gesso, just like the other mediums. I actually really like to use matte medium instead of gesso. I don't really like the texture of gesso, so if I can use anything else in place of it, I will. If you're gonna use this modeling paste as gesso, then you wanna sand it after it dries before you paint on it. So we'll apply it thin at the bottom here just so we can test out the transparency, but as you can see, it's already less transparent than the other ones. The texture that I get here, I get some good texture, but it's a little bit softer than with the gels. We'll add some by itself over here. Some of you have asked about absorbent grounds, and you can use this as an absorbent ground. You would just mix 1 part of the modeling paste to 3 parts gesso. And of course you'd want to sand it in between each application, but you can absolutely use that as an absorbent ground for when you are using paint very thin or using watercolors, just whenever you need a surface that's a little bit more absorbent. See, with the paint, without the paint, I get a little bit of a heavier texture. See the difference in texture there? With the paint, it's a little bit softer, and over here I've got some nice sharp spikes in the texture. And my canvas is quite a bit heavier than any of the other ones, so if weight is going to be an issue, this might not be something that you want to use. Okay, our next medium is actually not a Liquitex medium, but you guys have asked me about Crackle paste a lot, and Liquitex doesn't actually make a Crackle paste as far as I can tell. So this is the golden brand, but just like I said on the Liquitex, we have little sliders here. So the first one indicates whether or not it's transparent or opaque, and as you can see, it's almost all the way over to opaque. Now, having used this one, I know that this is about as opaque as it gets. I think the reason the slider is not all the way down is because as it cracks, it may show some of the underlying color. The next one indicates whether this is matte or gloss, and the slider is all the way over to matte. It's a very, very matte surface, kind of has a texture similar to paper. And the next one says thin or thick, and the slider is all the way over to thick. It's a very thick paste. It's very, very lightweight and airy. And as the name paste would indicate, it's quite absorbent. Now I'm not gonna mix any color into this one. I'm just gonna get some out. See, it's quite thick, and we'll spread it on here. Now, when you are using Crackle paste, keep in mind, the thinner you spread it, the smaller and closer together the little cracks are gonna be. If it's very thick, the cracks are gonna be much deeper, wider, and farther apart. But you can get some amazing texture with this stuff. So we're gonna do a little bit of some thinner areas and some thicker areas. And this takes quite a while to dry completely. But after about 10-15 minutes, you may see some cracks starting to form, but you don't want to paint on it until it's 100% dry, or you'll re-wet the paste and you'll lose some of those cracks. Now you can mix paint with this, but just like with the modeling paste, because it's white and it's gonna dry white, it will tint your color a little bit. I haven't tried it, but I would avoid adding too much paint to this because I feel like you may lose some of the cracking ability of it. So I usually just use it white and then paint it afterwards. All right, now we're gonna start talking about some of the texture mediums. So this is ceramic stucco. Now this is a really cool medium. It's got a fine, gritty, sand-like material in it. And I forgot to mention, but you can apply all of these mediums with a brush if you like, including this one. So see, we've got some pretty good texture there. It's quite firm, and it's gonna dry the same color that you see here. So it'll have a slight gray, semi-matte, and it will be opaque. So it will tint our color a little bit because it's gonna dry that color. Let's go ahead and throw some yellow in there. And you can already see it's starting to change the color of the yellow just a little bit, making it just a little bit more drab. And then we'll apply some on its own. So when this dries, it will look almost exactly like this. It just won't be quite so shiny. It's a little shiny right now while it's wet. All right, the last one we're gonna talk about is glass beads. This is a super, super fun medium. I really, really like this one. This is a medium body gel. So I would say it's pretty similar in texture to the gloss gel. So we've got a good amount of viscosity in there, but it also has these little tiny plastic beads in it. And I don't know if you can tell, but it kind of looks like tapioca pudding while it's wet. I know it looks white, but when it dries, it will be clear. And the little glass beads that are in it, or the little plastic beads in it, are perfectly clear. So we're gonna put some of that out and mix it with some yellow paint. And any of these texture specific mediums, so this or the stucco or the many others out there, you can mix them together to get different types of textures. So if you mix this with the stucco, you'll have that really fine grain texture of the stucco mixed with the big glass bead. So again, see, it extended my paint. It didn't change the yellow at all. If you wanted to thin it down, you didn't want quite as many beads, just use one of the gel mediums. And if you use a brush to apply this medium or the stucco medium, I would wash it out really good afterwards so you don't get those little bits of grit and beads stuck into your brushes. If you apply it really thin, and I'll show you this when we start painting on these, so I'm pushing my palette knife so that I'm only getting one layer of bead. Then when it dries, the gel will shrink down just a little bit and the beads will sit up higher above it, and they'll act like little windows. So if you apply a thin layer of paint over top of it and then kind of wipe it off of the surface of the beads, you create little windows so that you can see the background through it. And it's really an interesting effect, but I'll show you exactly what I mean once it's dry. All right, we're gonna let all of these dry, and then when they are done, we'll come back, see how they've all changed, and we will start adding a little bit of paint so that you can see what happens when you paint on top of the dry mediums. Okay, so it's been about 24 hours, so our mediums are for the most part dry. Let's go through each of them, see what happened, and we'll apply a little bit of paint. All right, so here is the first one we did, the gloss gel. And as you can see, it dried very transparent here where it was thinner, and then up here where it's thicker, it's a little bit more almost opaque. Now, I'm not convinced that it's fully dry. When I push on it, it's a little bit soft there. So if I let this dry for another day or two, that would probably get a little bit clearer, but I don't think it would go completely transparent. Here where we added the yellow paint, it's a little more transparent than it was before. The paint being a little thick helps reduce the transparency a bit, but as you can see the texture of the canvas, you can see the weave, and you get a little bit of a green cast from the blue underneath. Up here where it's thicker, again, it's a little bit softer. But as you can see, our little peaks stayed. We got some nice sharp little points in here, but it's still very flexible. So I can push that little peak over and then it stands back up on its own. So it's still very flexible even after it's dried. Let's brush on a little bit of yellow paint on top of the clear and see what happens. So I wet my brush in the jar a little bit, wiped off a bit of the extra, grab some yellow paint, not a whole lot, and we'll just brush it on. And see, we're almost getting a little bit of a glazing look, and I like the way that the texture kind of traps some of the yellow, so I get those little ridges. That's a really cool thing to use if you're trying to do like something heavily textured, like tree bark or even a ground, and you don't want to spend so much time putting in texture ridges, using all kinds of different paint. Just paint against the texture, and it almost looks wrinkled. And if we apply more paint, that's even more apparent, those textures in there. But see the difference between adding the paint to the medium and painting over it. Because this is glossy, the paint's not absorbing into it, it's just kind of floating along the surface of it. Let's just play and add some to the whole thing. See what kind of texture we can show off. Okay, our next one was the Gloss Heavy Gel. And it's not quite as transparent here, but I may have applied it a little bit thicker. It feels pretty thick right there. Over here, you notice this is almost pure white. And if I push on it, I can still feel a little bit of squish in there, so it's not fully dry. And remember, this is the one that I said would extend the open time of your paint more than any other medium. So that's why this one's not dry yet, especially up here in the yellow. I feel like if I pushed on that really good, that I'd have some of the medium kind of squirt out of it. So this one, especially if you apply it thick, is probably gonna take a couple of days to dry. Maybe even 3 or 4. But again, look at the texture on there, how it stayed. This nice, sharp, almost delicate little point, and it's very flexible. And then it'll kind of come back up to the shape that you left it in. So this is gonna be very similar to the gloss gel when I paint over it, but the textures are a little bit more intense. So again, we have more of a glazed type look. Even though we didn't mix anything with the paint, we just applied it over top of the dry medium. And that really looks similar to if we had taken glazing medium and mixed it with the paint and put it on top of this blue surface. And our next one is matte gel. So again, we've got some opacity going on up here, and I don't know if you can tell, but it's all got a little bit of a white cast to it. It's not perfectly see-through. Even where you can see through it all the way, the detail of the canvas is just a little bit more fogged down. It's not quite as crisp as with the gel medium. It's got a very smooth texture, very soft. It's not glassy and slippery like the gel medium. And again, it's not quite as transparent here, though you still can see some of the green coming through into the yellow. So let's add a bit of paint on top of this one. The texture is exactly the same as we left it, and it's pretty dry. It seems like this dried as fast or maybe even a little bit faster than the gloss medium. It doesn't feel too wet under there still. Now when I apply this yellow on here, it seems to grip the paint a little bit more. And I really like painting on a matte surface. So if you don't like gesso and you've got some of this, I would say throw down a layer. The cool thing about these, and I didn't mention it with the other ones, but it's the same with the gloss and the heavy gloss, is that if you lay this down over a colored ground like we did, and then paint another color over it, you can't really tell where I went off of the medium and onto the canvas. I mean, you can tell by the texture, but as far as how the paint looks on it, it really looks the same. So you can lay it down and then not be afraid to paint over it that you're gonna have this weird transition where you went from the medium to the canvas. And here I just wanna show you the gloss gel with the yellow paint in it compared to the matte gel with the yellow paint in it. And it might be hard to see on the camera, there's a little bit of a difference. The yellow in the matte one seems to be a little bit brighter, where the yellow in the gloss gel is a little bit greener because the color underneath is coming through a little bit more. And our next one is the modeling paste. And this one actually dried fairly quick. I was a little surprised. I thought that this one would take quite a while to dry. The texture is very soft, very almost paper-like, but the material is very hard. And it's quite opaque except where we spread it very, very thin. Nice sharp peaks still. The thing with this medium is it is not flexible. So if I come to one of these little spikes, I can just pull it right off. It just kind of snaps off. So if you're gonna do really delicate, spiky work like that, I would use a different medium because it won't last. With this one, they just pop right off. So this will be interesting to see because this medium is a little more absorbent. See how that yellow is a little bit more intense and a little more true than the others. And unlike the others where you could paint on the medium and go right off of the canvas and not see a difference, you're gonna see that difference here. Another really fun thing to do with any of these textures, especially ones like this that are white, that will give you a true color, is to paint it one color, let it dry, and then get some glazing medium or something and do a wash of another color, because then it will sit down in the depressions and really show those off a lot more. The peaks won't really pick up the color quite so much, but down inside, you'll get a little bit of pooling of that color. And it looks fairly similar to the one that we mixed the paint in with. A little bit different, but pretty close. And Crackle paste. If you can see that, right here where it's very thick, the cracks are deep, they're wider, and they're much farther apart. Over here, hopefully you can see that, these cracks are very, very small, and they're super close together, right here where the paste is very thin. So that's a really fun thing to experiment, is getting different thicknesses of the medium so that you get a variation in the cracks. This is also a very absorbent medium, so it's really gonna take this yellow in and be nice and bright. It's almost like painting on paper, I feel like. Now, because this is an absorbent medium, you can be a little looser with the amount of water that you use. When a surface is super absorbent, it will suck up the little particles of pigment in the paint. So I know in the fluid mediums video, I stressed not using more than 25% water. But that's for like typical canvas or non-absorbent surface painting. For absorbent surfaces, you can go a little bit more. But you still want to be very careful with it afterwards and absolutely make sure you varnish it. Did you notice how much paint I went through trying to cover this? I just picked up a tiny bit of water and I'm just going to lightly smooth over top of it. Even though this is dry, you don't want to wet it down too terribly much because you can re-wet this. It will re-wet, you might lose some of your cracks, and it might muddy up your paint color. Okay, so we're gonna let that dry, and then we're gonna come back and I'm gonna show you another cool thing that you can do with this. All right, our stucco medium. So as you can see, it's very matte. There's no gloss to it. See, now that it's dried, you can see through it a little bit more, especially here where it's thinner, because the gel that the sand aggregate is suspended in is a little white when it's wet, and then it goes clear when it's dry. But this really feels like beach sand or something. It's very fine, it's not super chunky, but it is a little abrasive. It could quite possibly scratch you if you're not careful with it. So if you use this in a painting, make sure that you varnish it really well afterwards to avoid that. Even in this one where we added the yellow paint, if you look closely, you can see some of the little flicks of different colors. Because this isn't a solid color, there's some little darker specks in it here and there, and you can still see all of that in the yellow. This one dries pretty quick. I would say this is probably one of the fastest drying ones. Now this one is not gonna be quite as absorbent as some of the other ones because it is a gel-based medium. It's got the sand, but sand isn't absorbent, and the gel medium is not absorbent. But the little bit of texture in it will kind of make it seem like it's absorbing it. So we do get a color with this yellow very similar to the first one, except we also get it sitting down in those recesses and showing off the texture a little bit more. And it's still quite flexible. I've got a couple little pieces here that are kind of flopping around as I paint over them. So it's not going to be brittle and break like the modeling paste. So they look pretty similar after they're painted over. And our last one, the glass beads. As you can see, this dried very, very, very clear. It's still a little foggy up here, but I feel like it's because it's not totally dry. I bet that that would go more clear. Over here, it didn't really go very clear on the beads, but you can still absolutely see them and you can feel the texture. Now I'm gonna let this dry for just a few minutes and then we're gonna come back and I'm gonna buff the top of the beads, get that yellow paint off of them so that you can see that little windowing effect where you'll be able to see the blue through the yellow. All right, so back to our Crackle. I'm gonna take just a little bit of a damp brush and lightly brush over this. The yellow is about dry. It might still be just the tiniest bit wet. I'm gonna show you how to really show off those cracks. I think I might have put too much yellow in some of the heavier ones, so I might have lost them. All right, now I'm gonna take a little bit of phthalo blue and quite a bit glazing medium. And just start lightly brushing over it. And I'm just using these colors because they show up well with each other. You can use any colors you want. This is a really cool material to use for like an old wall or a desert ground. All kinds of things. Anything you want to make look weathered and cracked. I'm going to take a paper towel and I'm just going to absorb some of this off of the surface. So can you see how some of the cracks show up really, really well? The blue getting down inside of there really helps set them off. I did lose a few of them over here because I applied too much yellow paint and it got down in the cracks and kind of sealed them up. But over here where we have these fine ones, you can see them a lot better now. All right, our glass bead medium. I have a paper towel here that's just slightly damp. It's not soaking wet. I'm gonna pull it so I have a flat side here. And I'm not gonna mush it down into the beads. I'm just gonna lightly wipe across the top. Get a clean side of the paper towel whenever it gets too much paint on it. This is really fun to do if you have like a really bright color in the background and then you coat it with black or even a metallic color under there. Now you can see the surface of the beads a little bit better, as well as the blue. It's super hard to show on the camera, but once this is completely dry again and you hold it into the right light, the beads really cast light underneath and you get this nice little sparkle. So this is a really fun thing to do as well. This would be a fun medium to use for maybe like an ocean floor in kind of a whimsical ocean scene. So I hope that this was helpful information for you and taught you a little bit about mediums, how to know the difference between a gel and a paste, and how to get a general idea of what a medium will do just by looking at the jar. If you have any questions about the products that I've covered today that I didn't answer, leave me a comment below and I will see if I can answer that for you. As always, make sure you check out the video description for links to where you can find me all over the internet. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and maybe share it with a friend who you think would like it as well. If you haven't yet already, make sure that you subscribe so that you can paint with me every week and get fun extra videos like this once in a while. If you haven't yet already, make sure you check out video number 1 in the Demystifying Mediums series where we talk about fluid mediums. Thank you as always for watching, everyone, and I'll see you next time.